Greetings and welcome to Lecture 9 for ISDS 3120. So we've now seen the relationship between strategy, structure, and systems. We've talked a lot about how companies decide whether to work outward or work across or work inward, and how that relates to their overall strategy. How each of these different approaches and systems it reflects their different focus on Porter's 5 forces. We talked a lot last time about structure and strategy, about how the business processes are enabled by IT. And we've talked about how once we change one element, we need to change another. And we really drew from socio-technical systems theory. Remember, changing technology means changing tasks, people, and structures. So how do we go about making this change? How do we go about changing our organization if we need to change one of these elements? The way we do this is through the process of change management. Now, as we go through this lecture, this is going to be kind of a unique lecture, at least for me, because a lot of some of the material that I'm going to draw from in this lecture is actually based upon my own research. So the area that I'm probably most well known for in my own work is really understanding how people respond to technology. My research for the past 15 years is really trying to understand why, when we give people technology, why do they respond to it the way that they do, and how do we influence how they respond to this technology as well. Now, keep in mind, when we talk about deploying technology inside of an organization, the reason we deploy these systems is because that we think that how people use the technology will make our companies better. And so if we use the technology better, then as individuals, it's going to lead the organization to be more effective. It seems logical, right? When we talk about the reason why we deploy a technology like a working inward technology, we're deploying it as a strategic response. But if we deploy these technologies and people resist them, then how are we ever going to see the change in our companies that we desire? We talked on Monday about CRM, and we talked about how a lot of times salespeople are very, very reluctant to use a CRM. And we said because it requires them becoming different in how they approach the concept of sales. Well, if your employees don't use the CRM the right way, then how is it that the company is going to have all the data on the customers that it needs to make good decisions? So we know that we have to get our employees to use technology better than others. So let's put this in a different way. Let's pretend that I came into class one day and I gave all of you a new device, a new iPad, maybe the iPad Pro as an example. I would bet that if I would find out that there's 30 of us in class, I would bet that in about a few weeks, 10 of you would probably end up using the iPad in ways that I could never envision, very creatively, very pushing the boundaries. 10 of you are probably going to use it just as it's supposed to. And the other 10 of you will probably never use it at all. You'll forget that you even had it. Why? Why is it that certain people use technology differently than others? Now you're saying, well, why does this matter? We have to use technology. We've talked about that all semester long. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. Yes, however, depending upon how you use it and how your employees use it, then it will affect what kind of a response the company has to all the money that you've just deployed the technology for. So let's start to think through what this process looks like and why this is such an important thing for us to understand. Do we love all the technologies that we use? In other words, do we accept all the technologies that they use? Acceptance isn't use. What does that mean? Okay, let's think about this from a very psychological perspective. Does this mean does this mean that everyone loves the technology that they are using? Absolutely not. I'm sure if you take a technology like Moodle, I'm sure some of you look at Moodle and it's very frustrating sometimes because things aren't always in the right spot, but you have to use it anyway. The same thing is true for CRM. The same thing is true for ERP. The same thing is true for all the technologies that we use inside of companies. Not everyone loves the technology that they are using in order to accomplish their tasks at work. However, if psychologically people were more accepting of it and less resisting of it, don't you think that they would use it better? And the answer, of course, is yes. So when we talk about getting change management and really approaching this well from an IT responsibility, really what we need to do is we need to get people to really understand how to use technology better in order for us to be successful. So if just because they're using it, does that mean that that technology itself is successful? And the answer, of course, is no. So how is it we can get people to accept change? How is it we can get them to, when we give them these systems that we know are important for the company, how is it that we can get people to embrace this change? Let's start with something that as an axiom that I know to be true. Everyone resists change. I can tell you that for sure. Based on all my years of observation and study, everyone resists change at some level. Not everyone looks at everything and resists it at the same speed or veracity, but everyone on some level resists technology when it's newly deployed. Some people resist it more than others, but everyone on some level does. So when a company goes out and spends millions and millions of dollars on an ERP solution, and then you have a pocket of people who resist the technology and they don't like it, that's going to slow down the company from overall achieving success. In other words, from achieving the benefits that why we went ahead and deployed the technology. All right, so we say, all right, I know that to be true and I understand where you're coming from. However, how do we approach this differently? Well, let's begin with some basic assumptions. So what people tend to think is that people overall and that users overall are similar. What does that mean? Okay, so if I were to ask you just kind of off the cuff and thinking about it, do you think certain people are able to accept and use technology more likely than others? And you, of course, would say yes. All right, well, who are those people? Some people say, some research has said, well, you know what? It's gender-based. That men tend to think like technology, think a certain way logically better, and so therefore men accept and use technology better than women. I can tell you that this is simply not true. Gender plays no role in how people think about technology. Some people say, well, it's based on age. The millennial generation, they love technology more than the baby boomers or maybe Gen X or Gen Y. Again, not true. There's no relationship between age. There's no relationship between gender. So one of the mistakes that we can make when we try to get people to accept new technology and to use technology is to assume that user behavior is deterministic. User behavior is not deterministic. You cannot profile a person and assume that based upon their gender, their age, their experience, or where they're from, that all of a sudden that one person or group of people is going to take technology better than others. The second thing that we have to understand when we talk about getting people to accept this new technology and use this new technology is to understand that the social nature of a company is important. What that means is that we have to understand that inside of companies, groups of people communicate socially to one another. And based upon how your group of social peers views a technology, you tend to view it the same way as well. So I've gone into companies before and I remember talking to one particular company, and the CFO had called me in to talk, and he said, well, we spent all this money on this new ERP, but yet no one is using it well, and no one likes it. Well, as I started talking around to the people and worked in accounting, what I found out was there was a pocket of people who got together over lunch every day and just complained about the ERP. So of course, when they got back from lunch, they did not like the ERP and they didn't use it the right way. We have to understand that the social power influences how people think about technology. And if you tend to associate people with people who don't like a technology, you won't either. And it also matters where the people you associate with sit in the organization. Point 3, power and politics play a role. If you work, I found in my own work, if you work for a boss who hates a given technology, you will not like it as well. You tend to associate with someone in a position of power above you. Or if it's in your political best interest not to like the technology, you won't as well. Number 4, overall, the motivation of there's a disconnect between what users want and what's good for the corporation. Now, if you've taken my class in 4111, we spent a semester talking about ERPs. And you know, after spending 15 weeks using SAP, SAP is not a very user-friendly system. So, for those of you who have never used SAP before, for most of the times when you employ a system like SAP, which is an ERP, all of a sudden you're taking a task that was very, very simple and you're making it harder. Now, for upper management, the ERP is wonderful because it gives you more data and it gives you more information. However, the users don't like it because it made the user's job harder and more complicated. So there's a disconnect between what's good for the user and what's good for upper management. So with that understanding, when we talk about why people resist technology, oftentimes is viewed through the lens of what's good for them. And lastly, upper management support is crucial. One of the key things that we'll see as we go throughout this entire presentation is upper management, the CEO, the CIO, the CFO, how they view the technology will largely determine if the company is overall successful or not, and whether or not people are resistant to the change. There are 4 factors that go into whether a technology, an IS, an information technology, is successful or failure. Those 4 are: 1, the users have to be involved and have some influence over the decisions that are made. Too many times I've seen companies that don't get the users involved. Just last year I was called in to help out with a hospital. And as I was interviewing the doctors in the hospital, I found out that the doctors had recently deployed a new electronic medical record software. However, not a single doctor had been consulted as they went through deploying it. And these were the end users. So the users said, well, of course we don't like it. No one asked our opinion. I was talking to a secretary once where they had deployed PeopleSoft, another ERP solution. And the secretary said that she felt like her world had been turned upside down because no one had ever asked her what she thought of the technology. So that technology from her view was considered a failure. So users have to be involved and users have to have some influence. 2, upper management has to support it. If the upper management is not on board with the technology being deployed and they don't sanction it, then the rest of the organization won't think it's important for the company. Top management has to deem the technology to be important in order for people to be willing to change. 3rd, the more complicated, the more risky, the more complex the technology, the more likely that you are to have people resist the technology. The simpler, the easier it is, the less risky, it means that you will be more likely to be successful. And lastly, when we talk about change and risk management, which is the purpose here today, if you don't implement the process well, your users are going to be less likely to accept the new technology. Now, hopefully, as you went through project management and systems analysis and design, if you went through 4125 and for 4113, hopefully, as you went through that, your professors talked a lot about the best practices associated with deploying and developing new systems. And at each one of the phases of that, users get involved. Whether it be prototyping, JAD, or RAD, the key is users have to be involved in the process. And if these 4 factors hold to be true, the overall technology is more likely to be accepted by the people, and the amount of resistance that you will encounter will be less. So again, just to recap, there are 4 factors in IS success or failure: users' involvement and influence, top management support, effective management of the level of complexity and risk, and the management of the implementation process. But what do we really mean by success? So I did some work a number of years ago where I did a 5-step research project. I got 12 executives, and I just listed these out so you can see that they spanned a lot of different industries and perspectives. And what I found is that when we found out that there are a number of different benchmarks that we use to be success. The first is that the system fulfilled the business case. So this shows you that there's no such thing as a technology project, just business projects about technology. Second is return on investment. Did the investment that we make yield returns? We're going to talk all about the economics of IT after our next exam. Third, whether the technology is adopted and used by the users. Fourth, whether it delivers expected requirements to the business. Fifth, if the business was involved and committed to the project. Sixth, if the customers were satisfied. Seventh, if it adds value. Eighth, if it's delivered on budget. And ninth, on time. Now, these will not be on your exam, but I ask you this. When we talk about technology success, do you see anything there about whether or not the technology was well coded? Do you see anything about whether or not the technology was technologically sophisticated? No, you don't. What do you see? That technology is successful if it meets the demands of the business. In order for us to meet the demands of the business, we have to understand the business. And this is really a key theme. So what we have to do is we have to really, to get to that point of success, we have to engage in effective change management. And change management simply means the process of assisting people to make an alteration in their working environment. People resist change. So let's play out a scenario for you so that you can begin to understand what we're talking about with change management. So let's say that we go through the process of a strategy, structure, technology triangle, and we determine that we're going to set a new strategy in place. And that strategy means that we need to enact a new kind of technology. So let's play, just because it's really easy, let's pretend that we're going to deploy a CRM solution. That all of a sudden we're now going to keep track of our customers better. So what does that mean? That means now I need to deploy a new CRM, and since we talked about it Monday, let's use Salesforce.com. So we deploy Salesforce.com. Now all my salespeople need to be trained on this new system. All my call center employees need to be trained on this new system. So when we talk about change management, we need to get our salespeople to get from understanding how they used to do sales to how they do it now with Salesforce.com. I need to get my call center employees from understanding how they used to do work to how they do it now. And what I need to do is I have to get people to understand what this change looks like, recognizing that people are going to resist it. So what kind of resistance are we talking about when we said everyone resists change? There's three main ways that people resist change. First, they deny change is happening at all. They'll say, no, everyone else will have to change, but I don't. Second, they distort information that they hear about the change. Third, they convince everyone that nothing is really going to change. So I was doing some interviews a number of years ago with a company, and they were talking about, they had deployed a new ERP. And in this new ERP, it costs, of course, tens of millions of dollars. And one of the people I was interviewing had told me about how their company had gotten it for free, because the vice president of the ERP company knew the vice president of this particular company, and therefore they got it for free. She was distorting information. And therefore, if they did get it for free, she felt justified, because she felt like since it was free, she didn't have to like it. That's an example of resisting change. So when you talk to her about is this going to be good for the company, she said no, and she was resisting the change. I talked to one CFO who was so anti this new ERP coming in that he had actually ordered all the accountants to create a series of Excel spreadsheets, and he was going to track every single transaction that occurred in their ERP, because he wanted to show this ERP company that their ERP was broken, and he was going to show them their Excel spreadsheets. Of course, he was wrong, but that's a resistance of change. So you can see how in each of these cases we needed to get people on making a change. And since we have to get people to make this change in their working environment. And since we're talking about technology assume change, I'm going to assume here for a minute that we've made the right changes to structure and strategy, and all we're really talking about is getting people to adapt to the new routines. But you have to keep in mind that this is not only a technical challenge, it's political as well. Because as IT people, we often assume that if we give them an elegantly designed system, that everyone's going to love it. But if you look at the metrics of success that I cited above, what we see is that just because a technology looks great and acts great, and it may be the most wonderfully ever coded solution that's ever existed on the planet Earth, that does not necessarily mean that people are going to change. Many wonderful technology systems have turned into failures because you ignored people. A system is only a success if the users like it, if the users are happy with it, if the users enjoy it. IT is all about managing change, because as we talked about time and time again, you have to make a change to the organization. New systems require changing how work is done. Now remember, we talked about how Otis Line, and I made the case time and again at Otis Line that this could have been a failure because the field offices could have resisted the change, because we were taking away their power. We were making that power go back to the central office, but they were ultimately successful because they engaged in effective change management. If you focus only on, if you're an IT person and you focus only on the technical parts of the system, but you ignore the people side of the system, it does not mean that you're going to be successful, because the people side is change management. Again, just to reiterate, change management comes from socio-technical systems theory. Changing technology means changing people, changing process or tasks, and changing structure. You cannot change one without changing the other. Now, this is actually based on my own work and my own research. And so what I have found is that people go through a process. So everyone goes through a process when you give them a new technology. So what my work has found is that people go through a multi-stage process. The first phase, which was on the left-hand side, is stage 1, is receiving. They're going to ask whether or not am I willing to accept, to take in this technology without questioning it. Am I willing to stop questioning the technology, whether it's right or wrong or good or bad, and just be willing to learn it? That's the first step that users need to go through. If once they get past that point of saying, look, I'm not going to resist this anymore, I'm going to give into it, then they go to the second stage, stage 2, which is they need to understand it. Does this make sense to me? Can I understand how to use this on my day-to-day job? Now, they have to get past the point where they stop questioning it in order to get to the point where they can start learning it, because that's the second phase. The third phase, where it says assessing, that's where I'm going to start to say, all right, so I'm not resisting it anymore. I now understand it. Now is it valuable? Now does it make sense for me and my job and my company? If they can pass that point of viewing it positively, then they move on to the far right. And the far right says, on the top, being given, on the bottom, submitting. Being given says, all right, now am I willing to change myself? Am I willing to change my routines? And number 4B, is the technology so good that maybe I can use the technology to make other changes? So you see there's a process, and that's the whole point of change management. You can't assume that someone's going to go from stage 1 to stage 4, that they're going to all of a sudden move through that process without going through the other stages first. So you're saying, all right, that makes logical sense. But why do they resist it? Why do they reject it? Well, there's different kinds of rejection. There's active rejection and passive rejection. Again, this is based on some of my own work. Active rejection is when you actively engage in doing actual steps to actually stop or prevent the technology. That's the example of the CFO. He actually was actively rejecting it. Passive rejection is saying, you know what, I'm going to resist it, I'm going to hate it in my mind. I'm not going to do anything behaviorally, but in my mind, I'm going to do everything I can to not like it. Now, the motivation for these is completely different. People engage in a series of steps, active, because of a number of reasons. They do it for apathy, because they just don't care, so they act out. They do it for loyalty, because they're loyal to the technology or the approach that we had before. They don't see the need for it. They think it's too expensive. There's no advantage of it. They think that the quality is bad, or sometimes they're just worried about privacy. If they have these concerns, they will actively engage in behaviors to resist the technology. However, that doesn't mean just because they're not actively doing something, it doesn't mean they're not rejecting it psychologically. Someone who rejects it psychologically does it because they're concerned that the technology is going to be too hard. They're unaware of the benefits of it. They don't see the need for it. They don't see the advantage of it. So people reject technology for different motivations. All right, so to this point, we've said that we have to get people to make a change. We've said that there's different ways that they're going to resist it. We've made the case that we need to do this effectively in order to find success, and the success isn't technologically based, it's based upon the user's need. All right, so let's pivot. How do we actually do this? Well, we have to keep in mind that there's 3 groups of people that are really involved in change management. You need to have a sponsor. That's someone that says, hey, this technology is important. The sponsor needs to be the person at the top of the organization. That's the CEO, the CFO, the CIO. They need to come in and say, we need to make a change, and here's why. Then you need to have a change agent. A change agent is someone who causes this change to happen. Now remember, I said power and politics matter. and so do friends. So in this case, what we say is let's find some super users, some people in the company who everyone else looks up to, get them to like it, and use them to help other people like it as well. Because the people that we're trying to change is our targets. So we're going to use our sponsors, our change agents, and our targets. So how do we do that? Well, if you were in charge of change management, you would do a series of focus groups, and you're going to interview people, and you're going to find out whether this project is doable, whether we're trying to change too much at a time. How do people feel about it? So we know that people are going to resist. Are the sponsors committed enough to push their way through it, or are they going to expect the company to change on its own? You're going to read the case of Cisco this week, and Cisco is all about this type of change. And so as you're reading it, think about all the challenges Cisco had and see if they were able to stick their way through it. Third, do the change agents have the skills that we need to implement the change? And lastly, who is going to be receptive and who's going to resist? So once you've identified your target, you've identified your sponsor, you've identified your change agent, and you do those assessments. And from that, you get a picture. And you get an idea of how is the resistance going to happen? Is it going to be active? Is it going to be passive? And what is it going to take for you to overcome their feelings in order to give you success? Because you have to keep in mind, not all IT projects succeed. Many fail, especially the big ones. Now, the rate of failure we estimate between 30 to 70%. And you're going to say, well, why is that range so big? And one of the reasons it's so big is because when you ask people directly, did your project succeed or fail? A lot of people don't like to admit failure, but we know that all projects fail. Now, one of the big reasons why projects ultimately fail is because we don't manage risk. And there's two types of risks. There's technical risk and there's business risk. Technical risk is the elements of scope creep and the elements of technological change that we can't predict. All right, so let's put those aside because what we're really focusing more on business risk, which is where the business doesn't change. This is really the challenge of change management. Because when you're making this change, you're putting forth a huge risk. And this is all the material that you're reading about during last week of class. This is where all this plays in and it's a good hook to that. When we talk about making changes of this magnitude, it's all about risk management and change management. All right, so you've gone through your process of change management. You understand that people are resistant, and you kind of have a strategy for how to overcome it. So now what? Now you know what your risks are in your company. So how do I manage risk to make sure that those risks don't torpedo our project? There's 3 steps that we take in order to handle risk management. 1 is assess the risk, 2 is mitigate the risk, and 3rd is make sure that we're using the right project management approach. Number 1, assess the risk. There are 3 risk factors when we talk about introducing a new technology into an organization. Those 3 risk factors are the leadership of the change, the employee's view of the change, and the scope and the urgency of the change. Now, these sound a whole lot like those 4 factors that we talked about earlier, right? And yes, they do. There's a lot of overlap between the 2. All right, so what I want you to do is let's pretend that we're actually working. And let's pretend that you're the project manager. And your boss has now come into you and said, hey, look, we need for you to implement a new CRM solution. And we've gone through all of our different focus groups, and we know who the source of the risk is, and we know who's going to be resistant, and we know who's open to it. And so he's going to say, now I need you to manage the project. All right, now if you're in that point, I want you to remember this lecture from if you get to that point in your career. And here's what you need to do. You need to look at 3 things. The first question you need to ask yourself are my bosses, the CEO, the CFO, are they really behind this change or are they not behind this change? That's the first question you need to ask. The second question that you're going to look at, all that focus group, my employees. Are my employees on board or are my employees not on board? And the third thing you need to think about is this project doable? That's that focus group question, that first point we talked about. Is this doable or is this way too big? All right, so let's talk through what I do once we've done that analysis. We're going to read this slide from left to right, okay? So you're sitting at your desk. Question number 1, is my top management on board, yes or no? Where you see the plus on the graph ahead of you, that means that my top management is on board. That's plus. because the minus means that that's a source of risk. So question 1 under leadership, you see here it says plus and minus. Plus means my top leadership is on board. My minus means my top leadership is not on board. Now, there's a line here. You see this line right through the middle of the slide. And that line is a very important line because the very first thing that we need to do, remember I said top management matters, here's why. If my top leadership is on board, which is a positive, that means that you as a project manager, everything that you do will dictate whether or not that project is successful. What if it's a negative, which is down here? If it's a negative, which means my top leadership is not on board, you as a project manager don't matter. The only person that matters here is the project champion, because the project champion has to convince top management to get on board. That is why I said that top management support is the most important element when we talk about deploying technology. All right, so we've said so what we're going to do is we're only going to talk about things above the line at this point. So top leadership's on board, yes. Question number 2, are my employees on board? The plus means that yes, my employees are on board. The minus means they're not. The third question is, can I manage the scope and urgency of the project, or is it way too big? If I feel like I can manage it effectively, that's a plus. But if it's very, very big and I'm really concerned about it, that's a minus. So let's play out the scenario. You're sitting at your desk and you say, top management's on board, check. Employees are on board, plus. I can manage the scope of the project, plus. That means this fourth column, the likelihood of you making a change is very, very high. Why? Because the 3 sources of risk are not there. There's no big source of risk. Now, we're going to come back to this last column here in a moment. All right, so you're sitting at your desk for a CRM, and the leadership's on board. My salespeople are on board, but this is a huge project. So I only have one source of risk. All right, what's next? All right, top leadership's on board, but my salespeople, oh boy, they're a little worried, but it's really not that big of a project. I only have one source of risk. Again, less likely to be successful. In terms of things above the line, if leadership's on board, employees are not, and it's huge, that is the least likely scenario for you to be successful because you have 2 out of 3 sources of risk. All right, so I said we come back to the last column. So I want you to look at this column right here, and you said it says Big Bang, improvisation, guided evolution, and top-down coordination. Keep in mind those words because on the next slide, here they are again. Big Bang, guided evolution, top-down coordination, and improvisation. All right, so let's lay this aside for one moment, and I want to introduce you to 2 other concepts. First, as a project manager, you have a decision about what kind of project manager you're going to be. You're either going to be authoritarian or you're going to be more participative. An authoritarian project manager is a project manager who comes in and says, this is how it's going to work. And you basically tell everyone how you're going to work. A participative is one who's more collaborative, where they ask other people's opinion on your project team. All right, so let's pretend that as you're working on the group project, if you, as groups for this class, an authoritative group is one that basically elects a leader and all decisions are made by the leader and everyone else just listens and obeys. That's authoritative. Participative is where everyone kind of talks together and together you decide what to do. That's the top where he says management style. Let's go to the left-hand side. Now, for the group project, you know it's due on a certain date at a certain time. So you have a fixed project budget and a fixed deadline. Of course, in our case, the budget is 0, but the deadline is fixed. What if I told you, just get it done by the end of May? But if it runs late, that's okay. Well, you would love that, of course, except if you're graduating, but that's where it's an adjustable project budget, an adjustable project deadline. All right, so we've seen the outer part of the grid. We've seen the inner part of the grid. Now let's put them back together. All right, so let's go back to the plus. Leadership is on board. Employees are on board. I can manage the scope and the urgency. That's Big Bang. Big Bang, which is right here. So what this tells me is I, as a project manager, need to be authoritative with a fixed budget. So that means this. If you do the assessment and you're running that CRM project, that means that you can basically come in and tell people what to do and give them a hard deadline. Why? Because there's no source of risk. Plus, minus. That's improvisation. Now, the only thing wrong with improvisation is that that project is big and you're kind of worried about it, but everyone's on board. So you come down here to improvisation. That means that you need to get people to help you to be participative, and you need to have an adjustable project budget and deadline. Okay, plus, minus, plus. Leadership's on board, employees are not, but I can manage the scope of the urgency. That's guided evolution. That's over here. I need to get people involved, participative, but we need to get it done by a certain deadline. The last one, plus, minus, minus. That is top-down coordination. That's authoritative, but be flexible on your budget and deadline. So what you can see there is that there's a relationship between change management, risk management, and project management. So in order for us to assess, to really get people to change, we need to have the good project management that lines up with risk management, that lines up with change management. That's how we can be successful. Now, what happens though as the project evolves? Well, as the project evolves, sometimes risks change. Employees who may have been resistant before, if you handle this well, may come to be on board. So the salespeople, as you do your change management, may realize that this is going to be a good thing. So it could be that before they were resistant that they become more on board. And if that happens, then you need to reassess your risk management tree and change how you manage the project. Maybe the project gets bigger and bigger and bigger, scope creep. If it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that means that you need to assess risk. So every time that the project change, risk change, and you reassess this with a decision tree. In other words, you change your project management to accommodate the new change. So what you see is this: change management, risk management, project management. All three of these concepts are related together, but it's up to you to manage the change process well. To do that, how? Practically speaking, one, involve users. Tell them, figure out why is this important to them? Why is this relevant to them? And maybe they can offer you some advice. Remember, IT people, we don't have all the solutions. We don't have all the answers. Our answers are to help the users out. So one, involve users. Two, offer them training. Remember we talked about those stages that you need to go through. After you go through the process of deciding you're not going to resist it, then you need to understand it. Give good training. Speak the language of training in the language of the users, not in the language of IT. Third, give them the resources that they need. If you know that the technology is going to run slow and require a faster computer, give it to them. If you know that you have a group of people who are going to resist it, work with them and give them more training. Give them people that can shadow and help them out. Understand users. They have expectations, they have needs, they have desires. Not everyone is as computer literate as we are. Be sympathetic and walk a mile in their shoes. Find a champion. I was talking to an executive from a multinational company about a week ago, and she was telling me about how the first thing that she does in every project, before she even thinks about scope or requirements, is to figure out who's going to be her champion. Because she knows that if she gets a champion on board, everything else can fall into place. That was her big approach to change and risk management. And be sensitive. And I know that you're laughing when you say users have feelings too, but oftentimes we tend to think that the users are resisting for the sake of resisting. They're resisting for reasons that you or I may not resist, but they have feelings too when it comes to their resistance. Now, let's go beyond this and let's talk about some further implications. We need to understand that whether or not people accept and use technology is extremely important. It's really important for us to understand this concept of how people feel about the technology because it matters in how they use it. So you tend to think that it doesn't matter how you think about technology. It does, because you can manage the process. And so it really suggests that we as IT people, we need to be thinking in terms of total acceptance management, getting people to accept these technologies. So how do you get into that mindset? So prior to implementation, actively work with users. Walk a mile in their shoes. Do you really understand their processes? I encouraged, there was once I did a consulting project with a company and everyone was just resisting the technology. And they were having a hard time understanding why. Because from a technical perspective, the technology was flawless and it was perfect, or so we thought. And so when I came in as a consultant, I said, well, we did focus groups and everyone complained, and really we couldn't get to the bottom of why they were so resistant to it. They were describing how the technology was wonderful and there was more data available to them than ever before. And so it made no sense. Why were they so anti the technology if they acknowledged the benefits? It didn't make any sense. So what we decided one day is that we were going to basically follow them around for the day. And we were going to understand why they felt how they did. Now, granted, this was after implementation, but we would have saved ourselves if we had done it beforehand. So we ended up sitting down in the cubicles, and we watched people use a cubicle. Now, this was a document management system. And so we were sitting in the cubicle one day, and we saw them enter in a query, and they hit enter. And they got up, the person got up and walked away. They fixed some coffee and they came back. And they sat down and started to do their work. And we said, well, why, what just happened there? And the user said, oh, this is that's the problem with the technology. It's slow. Oh, the data is great. It's so wonderful, but it's so slow that anytime I need to run a report, I run a report and then I go to the bathroom or I get coffee before I came back. We didn't know that. So all of a sudden, by walking a mile in their shoes, it just took seeing that a few times and we understood their problem. We re-indexed the database, we did a couple of tweaks, and we sped the access time to under 5 seconds. And all of a sudden, that technology turned around. We didn't even know it was a problem because we didn't walk with their shoes. Getting those users involved reduces rejection. Be empathetic and communicate to them. During implementation, continue to communicate why this change was happening. Provide high-quality training and resources so that users can succeed. And more than one company that I've gone into, what they'll do with training is they'll hire an external trainer to come in and help people understand the job. The problem is the external trainer understands the technology, but it doesn't understand the company. Training has to give people enough context so that they can come in on day one and understand how to do their job. Manage the fact that they have expectations. They have things that they want the technology and need the technology to do. Support the technology during application. Afterwards, manage their expectation. Partner with them. Recognize that their perceptions are important to how the technology aligns with the business. A lot of times, technology people view business people as the necessary evil. They're the users, and they say that in a derogatory way. Don't view it that way. View the users as partners because you're trying to enact change management. Okay, I'm going to give you just a compare and contrast of what I'm talking about. On the left-hand side are philosophies towards IT that show me, as a consultant, that organization doesn't view IT in the right way. On the right side are the perceptions or the views that it should be. So I know that we're not handling that as IT people, that we're not doing it well if there's these kind of philosophies. Our users are ignorant. We tell them what they want. IT is in the basement. We don't communicate about IT to users. IT is viewed as a support. We don't even know how users feel. We get users involved because we have to. It just looks better that way. We have no idea what our users do all day. IT is expensive. We build applications. We don't even know if a system is successful. And understanding the psychology of users, that's not important. If IT has these mentalities, or if the business has these mentalities, that shows me that IT and the business are working together. So what should it be? What should this look like? We should be partners with our users. IT should be continuously educating users. IT should be partnering with the organization. IT should constantly be assessing how users feel. IT values the input of users. IT talks with end users, understands what they do, and understands how we can make their jobs better. IT is a source of growth, and we build relationships, and we have metrics, and really understanding how people feel is critical. So, as we draw to a close today, why do systems fail? IT systems fail for a number of reasons. One, we don't know what we're doing. Unclear requirements. We don't know why the business wants this technology. Two, we skip phases. You know what, that training, that's kind of expensive. Let's skip that. No. If we do that because it's expensive, it's more likely that your technology is going to fail. Third, users can oftentimes get excited about technology, just like IT people can too. And when they do, what can happen is we can have what's called project scope creep. Project scope is the size of the project. But what happens so many times is you see what we call scope creep, which is people add more and more requirements. So I was working with a company once that was looking into dictation software. What they wanted was they wanted the ability for a doctor to come in and dictate their notes and have that be transcribed. It was a very basic set of requirements, and the initial requirements list was very, very small. But what happened was, as the vendors came in and they talked about everything they could do, all of a sudden it moved from just having transcription to saying, well, maybe our doctors can order scripts and prescriptions, not just dictate, but order scripts. Oh, well, maybe they can do appointments with voice. Maybe, and so all of a sudden they went from just dictation to prescriptions to notes to this to that. It got bigger and bigger and bigger, and ultimately they ended up abandoning the project because it just got too big. They got more excited and added more and more projects. And remember risk management? One of them is that I can manage the size of the project. The project became unmanageable, and ultimately the project failed. We have to maintain the scope of the project. So, clear requirements. Don't skip phases. Manage the scope. Manage the plan. You've all had project management. You know what a project management plan is. Stick to it. Technology is going to change, and technology is going to change quickly. But the project sometimes can get very long. So what happens if technology outpaces the project? You're in trouble. That's why we talk a lot about rapid development. We talk about new kind of project management approaches where we are trying to speed up project management. And we're doing that because of the rate of technological change. And perhaps the focus of today being the most important, users don't accept the technology. We have to develop systems that encourage people to use it. And the way that we do that is get our users involved. So as you can tell, this is a particular subject that I'm passionate about and that I love to talk about because I think it's critical. If our users don't accept it, then no matter how great our technology is, it's not going to matter. Have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you again in class.